everybody, it's Carter. Welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the conversation series where two writers get to just kind of sit down and shoot the shit for a little while, about 45 minutes specifically. Today on the show, I had author Chad Boudreaux, and he's an interesting guy. First, I'll just note that his debut novel, Scavenger Hunt, is out at the end of January 2023, so probably around when this episode is releasing. And it's always interesting to talk to debut authors because I can think back to my time as a debut author and kind of what I was going through, and it's interesting to compare stories. But Chad's a pretty unique character. He actually he's had an interesting childhood that he gets into with during our conversation, and he went to law school and did some litigation work as a very, very young lawyer, and worked his way into the Department of Justice, where he was actually hired the day before the September 11th attacks. So he's had an interesting career trajectory kind of on that side of the equation. But on the other side has been his desire to write, and that has finally kind of manifested itself with this same debut novel, Scavenger Hunt. So, I always like to talk to authors who are similar to me in that they have a full-time job and they're writing as well, to talk about, we talked about the discipline that's necessary to having to do that, and kind of how to figuring out how to write, all the trial and error that you go through when you don't really come from a background in writing. And he makes an interesting comment about going back and looking at his, initial drafts and just seeing how many adverbs there were in them, and, just removing those adverbs, what a massive impact that made. So it's really fascinating to hear about, the path that this particular book went, and to hear kind of how he reflected upon where he's gone from there and what he's learned from that process, and then kind of what his desire to move forward with other novels is as a result of kind of what he's gone through with this first novel. So really, really interesting conversation. And he had some excellent advice for would-be lawyers out there. It was really intriguing to hear kind of some of his thoughts on the parallels between being a fiction writer and being a lawyer. So good stuff all around. Really, really great guy. This is my conversation with Chad Boudreaux. Hello.
Hey, Carter, how are you?
I'm well. How are you, Chad?
Doing great. Great.
Welcome to the program. Happy New Year. Happy New Year to you as well. Oh, you got the books behind you.
Yeah, I'm unembarrassable, so I hope you like it.
You're an author now.
That's right.
How does it feel? Well, I guess it hasn't launched yet, technically.
No, but the buzz around it's launched, and so that's exciting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in my profession, where we get excited about legal issues, and most people, even lawyers now, they want to talk about the book, and I'd rather talk about the book than legal issues. So it's
it's interesting. So I have a I've been writing for 20 years now, but I still have another full-time job. And but when people find out that you're a published author, that's just interesting, right? That people find that interesting. So it is kind of fun because it does become a little bit more about a part of your life that's, welled in creative energy rather than, like you said, like legal documentation.
Yeah, no, it's surprisingly good. I always thought that if I was going to be published, particularly as a novelist, that it would be good conversation. There would be, a good buzz around it, but it's been even better than I thought in terms of that's what really, even with very interesting legal issues that you're dealing with, you'll have lawyers that'll just want to talk about the book. And it also opens a lot of doors in the legal community that I hadn't expected either. So,
oh, that's interesting. One thing that I've discovered over the years is just that. So you note some people are really, really interested that you're a writer, and some people are just whatever. But there's a line of demarcation, and those who are very interested tends to be people, and they'll eventually say like, "Oh, I've always wanted to do this." And I've had this one story kicking around in my head, and I'm always amazed about the number of people who either have always wanted to write or have tried it, because it's such a difficult thing to do, but much more than I would have ever guessed, and it only comes out once they know that you're a writer. So you'll probably run into that.
And have you noticed that you can see it in their eyes when the issue of the book comes up? There's this, I have wanted to write a book. I have to ask him or her, when did you get started? What was your inspiration? How long did it take? That's the real question. But the major question is always, how long did it take you to finish?
Right. Or they'll say, so is this your full-time job? No, I'm like, not if I want to pay my mortgage this month. Yeah. And I'm going to get into this a little bit with you, but also just you get some people who are just like, tell me how to do it.
Yeah.
And you're like, look, I learned on my own. I didn't go to school. You can figure it all. Like the machinations of the publishing, like the query letter and how to find an agent. Some people just want to be handheld to them. Like, just Google it. There's a ton of information out there, and you'll figure it out. But you're in Virginia, right?
Correct. Yes.
And have you been there for a while? I mean, I assume with the work that you've done, you've been there for at least a couple decades.
Yeah, I mean, with a few exceptions, the first, 1/3 of my life to this point, we were in Texas, and then the next third after that, we were in Washington D.C., and then the last 11 years or so we've been here. That doesn't make me 33, but I'm taking off a few years. But
Right.
the way I divide it in my mind, it's really those three locations. But we like it here. It's where our job is. So it makes sense.
So you grew up in Texas?
Corpus Christi, Texas.
Okay. Yeah. I spent about 5 years in Richardson as a little kid, right outside of Dallas. But and you're growing up, what were your parents doing?
They were in the medical field, and my mom was a nurse. I've lost both of my parents at a pretty young age, which has been a pretty big influence on my life in a lot of ways. But my mom was one of the best nurses. I mean, she came from nothing. And, in my book, I dedicate my book to her, and I talk about her having me when she was 19 years old.
Oh,
and, in a pretty much a single mom shortly after that. She was married when she had me, and then my dad left soon after that. And just the drive that she gave me. So I can't talk about what it means to be an author without talking about the discipline behind writing. And I can't talk about the discipline behind writing without talking about the influence that my mom had, which was, dirt poor, sitting on a musty brown couch in a small apartment that we can't afford anymore. And just the tears of mascara coming down and dripping on me, and her saying, we are not going to give up. We're going to make it. We're going to make it. And I can't give that to my own kids. I'm glad they don't have to live through that.
Right.
But that is a driving force for me, that when I feel like I'm, I can't do it, or if I feel like I'm getting behind, I remember those words.
Well, discipline is a very, powerful word in the writing community, right? Because so many people don't realize that, sure, it's about talent and it's about creativity, but without discipline, nothing happens. And that's what happens to most writers, is nothing ever happens because they don't have the discipline to say, I'm going to do this every single day for an hour a day for the rest of my life. I mean, you have to enjoy it to have that discipline, but without the discipline, nothing happens. I mean, it's time and time again, I see it. So it's interesting to see that you got that from an early influence, but based on I'm curious to know, I mean, I and we'll go through it, but your kind of your work trajectory, but were you exhibiting creative roots as a kid? Were you wanting to be a storyteller?
Yeah, I think so. First, I'll just say that the path that I took, the legal path, people largely would attribute that to being less than creative. There's even the legal writing formula that you have is just pretty boring at its core. But again, I would go back. My mother, who raised me, was pretty much a hippie at heart. and there weren't a whole lot of structures around me other than you need to do what's right and don't do what's wrong. But I had a lot of freedom, and creativity was very much encouraged in my upbringing. And so and then I had some good family members and friends that were also creative. I never thought that creativity would be something that I spent a whole lot of time pursuing, particularly once I had an established career, but I think it just kind of draws you in.
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of writers on the show, and it is interesting to see. I'm personally just fascinated by the life path and the life choices of writers and how they got to be where they are now. And it's very rarely, I I went to school and got my MFA. It's always like, yeah, I was this creative person. I never really kind of acknowledged it, and it finds a way to burrow out through the skin at some point. It's like you said, it's unavoidable. But it's interesting what you say about you never thought you'd do something with it. It's like saying, hey, I've always had a good sense of humor, but I've never pursued stand-up comedy.
True,
The idea of taking something that's just almost a personality trait and then parlaying that into a career, or at least a published novel, is kind of hard to wrap your head around a little bit. Now, did you have siblings growing up?
I did not. I have my mom ended up remarrying, and I have two brothers now from
Okay.
her later marriage, and so they are fully my brothers, but they're much younger than me. They're 18 and 19 years younger than me.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so and they're back in Texas, and so we're close, but I didn't grow up with them.
Yeah. So you were pretty insulated, right? It's you and your mom and your imagination is kind of, you can see
for a
kind
large
of,
part,
yeah, you can kind of see the roots of it there. But then you chose initially to go through, or still to a career in, or at least law school, right?
Yeah. So for me, I mean, now, as you know, I'm a chief legal officer, and people always ask me, like, why did you want to go to law school? And, a good answer for that for anybody listening, because I know a lot of writers to be a good lawyer, you need to be a really good writer. So it's a good cross section, even though the writing style may be different. But my answer to a young, person who wants to be a lawyer is be a lawyer, because it gets you in front of the biggest issues quicker than in any other field. Maybe except for the medical field, but outside, for those of us who aren't good at science or math, we have to pursue something else. And so that's, I would like to say that's my answer. The real answer was, that's just what I thought I was good at. I was good at debate. I was good at making arguments, which probably doesn't say a whole lot about the genteel nature of my soul, but nonetheless, that's what was good for me. And I just, I thrived at it. And that was the best course for me to take. And then once I got involved in it, I loved it. So
yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because I've heard conflicting things about it. In terms of just the amount, obviously the amount of work to go to law school, the amount of writing and the amount of reading is can be overwhelming. But so we're very different, because I stray away from conflict. I'm not good at debating. I just want everybody to love each other. And so the idea of like arguing in front of a court like horrifies me. But the nature of what you and I both write is all conflict, and it's all tension, and it's all in a way dispute resolution. So I'm sure there was some of your background that informed how you approach dialogue between two characters and how you approached tension.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that just the more experience that you have with dialogue, I think the better you're going to be at dialogue. You see some writers, and I don't want to be critical, but my observation is some writers who are brilliant, who can write, just a narrative that will embarrass you because it's so good when you compare yours to theirs. And you can tell that they haven't been involved with people very often. They haven't had normal conversations, because the dialogue just doesn't sound real. And so I think there's a little bit of that with the legal field. You do particularly if you're a litigator. We have contracts lawyers and we have litigators. There's more to it, but those are really the two big paths that you will choose outside of law school. And those of us that are litigators, we tend to be a little bit more type A, tend to be a little bit more outgoing, and extroverts. I think I've taken a test and I'm a 65 to 70% extrovert. So I'm not one that, I'm not one that gets power from talking, or energy rather, from talking a whole lot. I still have to go curl up in a ball at the end of the day.
Yeah, you and me both. Yeah.
But at the same time, I do enjoy engaging in conversation. And as a litigator, you're constantly observing people. I remember when I was in DC, I was no longer trying cases like I did as a very young lawyer in Austin, Texas. But I remember it was almost a little creepy from my side, because I would just watch people on the metro. I would take metro to work every morning, and I would just observe how people would act. And it was all interesting to me, but it was more for a purpose of, okay, what are my jurors going to look like? And that's just how you're trained.
Right. And there's a level of inherent empathy, I think, that is not only necessary maybe to be a litigator, but is highly necessary to be, a fiction writer, I think, because you really have to, like, what is this person going to do? What would I do? How can I put myself in their shoes? And I think when you come across a novel where it's a little flat, I think there's just a lack of author empathy is kind of shining through in those cases. And I don't know if you can teach that, but that's my observation. At least I think empathy is kind of the key to being any kind of good writer.
I think life teaches that. I mean, oftentimes some people, really parse the language, and I don't know if this is right, but I've heard that sympathy is when you can, you kind of know a little bit what's going on with somebody, and you're there for them, and you care for them. You understand maybe what they're going through a little bit. Empathy is when you've actually gone through it yourself,
right? You can taste what it feels like.
Exactly.
You're
or
empathic.
it's real. Exactly. And so I think, it's those authors that write about their own experiences, I think, are going to have an easier job of coming across as being realistic, because they are going to feel that. They're going to know what it looks like.
Right. So walk me through post law school DC career path, because it's a pretty interesting story.
Yeah. So I started off again as a litigator. I was working for the biggest law firm in Austin right after law school, but I never worked a day for that law firm. I was taking the bar exam. And the way it works is, for some of the big law firms, they'll send you care packages while you're taking the bar exam, because they want you to eat well and pass. Nobody's ever failed the bar exam at this law firm, kind of thing, right?
Right.
And so at the end of that time, before I was about to take the exam, I just called. I was going to thank the people that sent me this care package. And when I called, there was nobody there that I had interviewed with. They had left the firm. And so so then I tracked them down. They had started a smaller firm, and the smaller firm lawyers said, "We'd like for you to come over as our only associate," which you have partners and you have associates in law firms.
Mm-hmm.
And I would be the youngest associate, obviously. And they said, "You can hang out in the library at this firm. I hear the air conditioner is very good, or you can come work for us and really try cases." And so I took a hit as financially to go try cases, and it actually worked out. It was one of the many risks I think I've taken in my career that have panned out. And I do think, for those listening who want to be a lawyer, I think if you really want to do really cool things, you're going to have to take risks throughout your career. But anyway, that's another story. For me, I ended up trying, enough cases to where I became a pretty seasoned litigator in a very short period of time. And then I leveraged that to go to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. And what I told them was, they said, "We have all these Supreme Court clerks and people who went to Harvard and Yale, and you didn't do any of that. Why should you come work for us?" And I said, "Because I'm the only one that's tried a case from the younger lawyers," and they were being hired at the time. And so that resonated with the person who hired me. And the rest is history. I got my call to come work there the night before the September 11 attacks. And so I was going in to be a torts claims lawyer in DC. And the next morning I was walking in to tell my senior partner in my law firm that I was leaving. And when I was in his anteroom waiting to meet with him, I saw the attacks happen on television. So
wow.
I knew after that I didn't even know if I was going to be moving up to DC at that point. They called me about 4 days later and said, "We need you sooner than later." And my wife and I, my Great Dane Judge, who's the only real character in my novel, we packed up a U-Haul trailer and, dumped everything at a farm, my wife's farm in East Texas. And we came up and lived in about the smallest apartment you could live in Washington, D.C.,
Wow.
like right next to the Supreme Court. And it was probably the most fun we've ever had that one year. And I don't want to make it sound like it was just this big fun ball, because it was very harrowing to be there. But
I'm sure.
But it was a brand new world for us. I mean,
Wow.
not only was America a different place after that, but we were still young and we had no idea what was ahead of us. And
Right. Wow. And then you're in that role for how long?
So I had different leadership roles at DOJ, Department of Justice. Part of the reason I think I was able to take on more responsibility quickly there is because we had the September 11 Victim Compensation Fund. And that was the fund that Congress had created to not only save the airlines from being shut down with lawsuits from victims and their families, and they had rightful claims, but also to compensate the victims in a very meaningful way. Money will never bring back anybody. Nobody ever said that, but there was a lot of needs that needed to be compensated for. And so that program was a once of a lifetime, well, maybe not once of a lifetime, but first of its kind in our lifetime. And I played a significant role in managing that for the department. We hired Ken Feinberg, who deserves all the credit.
Sure.
For pulling off the success of that program. I would never take credit from that, but I was kind of a worker bee that helped move things along. And I think some people noticed that, and that allowed me to move up. And when I moved up, there was just different levels within the department. I started off in the civil division, and then the way the department usually works, it can change depending on administrations or attorneys general, but you have an associate's office, which is kind of the third rung. And then you have the deputy's office, which is the second rung, and then the attorney general's office. And then I kind of worked my way up to the deputy's office, and before I moved on to my next government job. But that was the DOJ job. A lot of cool things that we did. Great experience for any lawyer at all, but especially for a young lawyer.
Yeah. So, and during all this work experience, were you even thinking about writing? Was that something that was kind of rattling in your brain at all, or it was just not even present?
It hit me about 6 to 9 months in, and what really did it was one of the craziest things. So, my wife and I were in our mid to late 20s, and I have the only thing we have is our dog, who's our baby. And he ends up getting diagnosed with cancer, terminal cancer, one night or one day. And that night, I just remember just staying up and holding him, shedding all sorts of tears. We just got a new dog. We just got a new dog last week.
Oh, I got him one about 2 months ago.
So it's been 20 years or more. Yeah, 20 years since that it took me to get the courage up to buy another dog. It's how devastating that was to me.
Wow.
And I should have bought one right afterwards. But the reason I didn't is because that morning when my wife woke up, I was still awake, had pulled an all-nighter just with my dog. She told me that she was pregnant with our first child.
Oh, wow.
And it was our first child who allowed me to stay awake a little bit later than I would. And that staying awake and needing something to keep me busy inspired me to write. And so there were things that I saw at work that were inspiring me to write, but that, staying up a little bit later than I otherwise would after work, I think gave me the incentive and the time to actually get it started.
But you pursue that, you actively pursue that as an outlet, because, most people would be like, I stayed up late watching TV, something very passive. And it's interesting because, so I started writing literally out of the blue when I was 33, and my wife at the time we were pregnant with our first child while I wrote my first book.
Yeah.
So I know that feeling of like, your energy around a growing family is different and your time is different. But I feel like once you get that thought process of like, I want to write something, it's almost unavoidable. whether you do it well or not is another thing,
Right.
but it's almost unavoidable. But how did you, this is what I'm really curious about, because I think we do have similar stories in the sense of like, we weren't trained as writers.
Right.
What was that process like for you? When you started writing, did you have a novel in mind, or you were just writing essays, memoirs, flash fiction, whatever?
So I took creative writing courses in high school. I had a very good high school teacher named Joe Wilson, who I haven't talked to in a while, but he was a great inspiration to me. Again, he was kind of one of those, there are no rules.
Right.
And I live in a world of rules for most of my day. I love departing that for a while and going to a world where I have no rules, and I live almost in a parallel universe as I'm writing. I know you, not being a full-time writer, we kind of know what that looks like, living in that parallel universe. And there is kind of psychologically a balm to that. So, but for me, it was trial and error. I started writing like a lawyer. There were a lot of moreovers and a lot of transition words, and it wasn't like you would write a work of fiction. And I knew I had a good story, and then it was just about refining it. And I did a lot of study. I shared my first draft or two, even my first couple of chapters, I shared with people that I worked with at the department who are also not authors. Some of them were pretty successful nonfiction writers because they were some of the best at what they did in their world, but not a whole lot of authors. And they encouraged me. It's like, I remember one of my best friends now, he told me, see it through. And so that's what I did. I just kind of went through, and if you looked at my first draft, you would probably say, oh my, where is this heading?
Ours.
I just worked at it. And even now, I mean, I think when Scavenger Hunt, when I sent it to the editor, it was, at about 115,000 words. And
that's long.
They were really pushing me down to be around 100,000 words. And I just remember reading Stephen King's On Writing, and he said, get rid of all your adverbs.
Right. The road to hell is paved in adverbs.
And I realized I think and speak and write in adverbs. Right. And I just went through and I started taking out adverbs. And even that, I think I had a really good draft for me at 115, 120,000 words. When I took the adverbs out, my writing became much richer. And
totally. And don't you see it now in other people's writing?
I do. It's writers that I love.
Yeah.
Writers that I love is like, why did you put the adverbs there?
Well, and I think it's also, James Clavell is a good example. I love James Clavell. I go back and look at his books. There's tons of adverbs in it. So I don't know. It's also a matter of, it changes over time. But like if I'm reading a book and it says, and somebody says something, and then the dialogue tag is, he said dejectedly, I'm putting that book down because it's so distracting. And, but once you realize that you can't not see it. So and Stephen King's On Writing has been referenced probably a dozen times on this podcast because and that's my favorite. I read maybe 4 or 5 books about writing, and that one I'm like, okay, this is just, it was so heartfelt. And so that first thing that you wrote, was that Scavenger Hunt, or had you written other things?
When we think about the novel and me being serious about getting a published novel, let me just step back. I've always told myself, I don't know why, and I tell my kids the same thing. There are many things you should do, but there are 3 things that you need to do. One is you need to learn a musical instrument. You should try to learn a foreign language, and you should try to get something published. And I put try in there because, not everybody's going to be able to pull all of that off. But it's something I think everybody should, because it stretches you. It stretches you in ways totally. that are good, and I think focuses you on something else other than what else is bothering you that day. But yes, I think if you look at Scavenger Hunt now, chapter 3 was the original chapter 1, and the inspiration for me for writing that book was the secret 8th floor at the Department of Justice that exists. And there's still most people who work there or have worked there don't know that it exists. And me walking up there with a flashlight and a custodian and walking around and having him tell me kind of the history of that place fascinated me. It still fascinates me. But I had a little notepad and I was writing notes, and a lot of the notes there are now memorialized in chapter 2 of Scavenger Hunt. Okay. And that one is what, once I wrote that down, I realized that I had to finish, because there was no other book.
That was my next question, because it seems like there would be.
There's no other book, nonfiction or otherwise, that I'm aware of that has described that. And It used to be the FBI ballistics lab. It was a real place. It's not operable now. It's more of a, you see water coolers and water chillers and other things, equipment that I don't really know much about, is because that's not my expertise, but low hanging chains. I mean, it had a macabre feeling about it.
Yeah.
And, and then just to have somebody who knew what they were talking about say, all these are bulletproof windows now after the Oklahoma bombing.
Yeah.
And,
wow. That's so interesting.
Stories along the way.
Yeah. And your friend's advice, see it through. Yeah. I mean, that's about as succinct and necessary advice as you can give a writer, because just going back to my earlier comments, the seeing it through is what most people don't do. And I always kind of liken writing to working out. It's like, you do it every day. You do it every day. You don't always want to do it. Sometimes it totally sucks, but you see results, over time. And I think now, back to like when I first started writing and I didn't know what I was doing, it was really hard to write sentences. Like what, it was like trench warfare to like get a paragraph done, because I didn't know how to do it. Now it's easy because I've built that muscle. If the hard part now is just knowing what the hell I'm going to write about. But seeing it through is kind of the tricky part. So you finished your draft, and then were you thinking like, maybe I'll self-publish this, maybe I'll get an agent? Did you have a kind of a plan in mind?
Yeah. So I was going to go and this has gone, my book has gone through two tranches, really. There was the 2009 2010 timeframe where the book looked a little different. It certainly wasn't as, I don't think, well written as it is now, and the story had a little different ending to it. But I actually went out. I worked through Georgetown Literary Center. They're fantastic, by the way. And a woman named Carol Sargent there, and she helped introduce me to an agent, and somebody who really was good at what they did. And then he shopped it to like 8 of the big publishing companies there, maybe 6. And there were a couple that came back and said, so none of them were willing to take it on as is. There were a couple that said he needs to get a good editor, because again, my writing quality wasn't where it needed to be at that time. And then a couple that said we need him to write 2 more, because we're just going to lose money on a first time author. And at that point, I was discouraged at that point, because I thought I had a book that was going to be published. I'm not making an excuse, although the publishing companies were really struggling at that point, so they weren't taking anything, a whole lot of new authors anyway. But I said, forget about it. I'm about to take a new job. I put it on the shelf, and it wasn't until a few years later, and I was coming back from New Orleans from the Sugar Bowl, and I said, I've got to put Scavenger Hunt to bed, and what I'm going to do is, I'm going to get an editor, and I'm going to have him or her go through it. And I'm just going to publish this book for all those people who invested in it over the years. And that was it. That was all I was going to do. And so I cleaned it up. I spent several weeks cleaning it up, tightening it up, changing some things. I sent it to the editor, and she called me back, I think a day later, and said, why isn't this published? And give me a day or two. And then after that, it was published, and or they took it on. So I don't know. I think there's a time in an author's life where you realize, maybe it's probably different for a lot of people, but I think one of the things that I didn't truly appreciate as a an aspiring published author was you do have to go through the hard part. There is that, it's almost like an actor, whether, what I hear about being an actor is you have to go through a lot of hard work for most of them before it hits.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think some of that is just paying your dues.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it is just volume and getting into the right person at the right time. But more so than ever, I think, is you do get better at your craft.
Yeah.
The more you get turned down, and those of us who get turned down so many times, and then you say, I'm not giving up.
Right.
Back to where we started this conversation, you do get better.
Right.
And you have a publishable piece of work at the end. And I think the experts know that, but for those of us that are just, getting wet on this, it's hard to truly understand how that works.
Yeah. And, you always hear about the, whatever it is, the write 1 million words and then you'll start to get good. It's more than just that though, right? There has to be the desire to make it better. And that's a hard thing to do because it's very easy to be lazy writing, like to look at, to be self-editing and be like, yeah, that chapter's fine. As opposed to if you challenge every one of your sentences, how can I make this sentence the best possible sentence and serve the story the best? That's a lot of work. And you've got to have the passion to be able to do that because it's really sometimes terrible. I literally, because of my publisher asked me to do this, I just converted an entire manuscript from third person past tense to first person present tense.
Oh, wow. And
it was, I'm like, I will do 10 pages a day. But it would kind of have been easier if you just change, she went to I go. But when you realize the voice necessarily changes when you do that because you're seeing through their eyes now, you've got to put in the effort to really like, okay, no, it's got to sound different because I'm not being true to it. But I love the challenge because I'm like, this is going to make the book better. And that's a hard thing for me. That's a hard thing to do, to learn, and same thing with rejection, all that rejection or all, the 16-page, letter from your editor. You have to have that appreciation of like, this is all going to make the book better, even though it's going to take me 5 months to do this. Right. And to your point, my first 3 books didn't sell.
You can get there. You can get there with a good story. Right. But it may take you a really long time to get there. But I'm telling everybody it's worth it. It is so worth it.
It is worth it. And to your point earlier about, having the 2 different jobs, I write at night. I write for 1 hour a day. 5 p.m. I like literally close myself into a room with my cocktail. That's my reward for my day. I don't look at it as like, oh shit, I got to go right now. I'm like, oh, now I get to go right now. I'm excited to have that hour because I'm just in a different world. And I think once, that's how I realized that I was a writer, is that I wasn't just doing it to get a book published. I'm doing it because I'm excited about figuring out where this story is going to go. And so with all the rejection that I know I've received over that, I was saying my first 3 books didn't even sell. It was easy for me to kind of turn my back on them and be like, oh, that's okay. I got more stories to tell. That's how I think, that you're in it for the passion and not just for, I want to get a book published. And it seems like you have that passion.
So my time is in the morning, and I will wake up really early in the morning because I have to get started early for my job, but I will have my quiet time outside of my book. And then there is about an hour that I set aside. And sometimes it'll go shorter than that. Sometimes it'll go longer than that. And I just write. And sometimes I have a pretty good plan. I'm an outliner, but my outline is not sacrosanct. I will usually think about it in terms of 50 chapters, and I'll try to get as much of that 50 started to begin with. But my characters come alive in like chapter 3 or 4, and they start doing crazy things, and it completely turns my outline on its head in a better way than I would have thought. But that's the way it is. But after I don't know about you, but after there's a validation to getting published. There's a validation to getting reviewed by experts and just, people who you care about. And when they come back and they say nice things about your book and they want to read the next one and all of those things, then you want to write the next one.
Right.
And I'm like you, I don't really write books for fame or fortune. But I do like to get my stories out, and it's so fulfilling when people want to talk to you about your stories and explore your characters a little bit more, and just want to have those discussions. So I
Yeah.
spent the last year writing my number 2 book, and it was largely from, I would say, 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. in the morning.
Interesting. Yeah. That's that would be rough for me. Yeah, and sometimes I'm maybe a little bit glib about about rejection and the power of rejection, because I think rejection is very important, because I think it's a tremendous learning tool. But on the other side, to your point, you do need, at some point, you need validation. And when I first published, I think every author faces this of like, what do I do? Like in our cases, we're not really writers, where we weren't setting out to be writers, and now we have a book. What do we want to do with it? And it would be very easy to self-publish it, but I didn't, because I wanted that validation. I wanted an agent. It took me 75 rejections to get an agent. Mm-hmm. And it took me years to finally get published. But I'm like, I want somebody in the industry to take a chance on me, because that is so much more fulfilling than just putting it out there and be like, I wrote this book. And it's different for everybody, and then, as you said, you start to get reviewed, or maybe you get a starred review, or maybe you hit a bestsellers list. All of that just, gives you just enough confidence to keep doing it. Because otherwise you're just going to put a bullet in your head at some point, because it's a brutal industry. There's no two ways about it. I mean, I can name on probably, one hand, the number of close friends of mine who are like fully supporting themselves at a high level writing. Most people don't, and that's just the reality of it. But if you're a storyteller, you're going to keep doing it no matter what, I think. And it sounds like you have no plans to hang it up.
No, again, it's therapeutic for me to write.
100%.
And you mentioned something earlier that resonated with me. I have a really hard, so I do like watching TV. I waste a lot of time watching
me
sports
too.
in particular, but I do have, I get down on myself when I waste too much time, because I feel like I've got a lot of responsibilities in my life. And when I'm just throwing time away on something that's not very edifying for me, I'm not learning something new. I mean, I like to play the guitar. If I'm playing the guitar, then at least I'm learning something as I go, and enjoying it. But if I'm just watching TV over and over again, even on vacation, I have a hard time the next day kind of justifying that. And so for writing, it's not only fun for me, it's rewarding. And I feel like that I've accomplished something, not only something that I can point to, but that may be published and live forever,
Right.
So it really is, that's very helpful to me. And it helps me get my mind straight before I go into, whatever I'm going to be facing at work, or whatever the challenge is.
Yeah. When you think about even the power of writing on the continued development, or, the prohibition of deterioration of your brain, because I mean, when I'm writing, it's basically problem solving. I'm trying to figure stuff out. And that is so powerful to they talk about, hey, you should do crosswords as you get older. Writing a book, man, right. I can't think of anything that's going to keep your mind strong than constantly going through that process of problem solving to create a novel. So, that's why, you hope to do this until the bitter end, because, I think it's so good for you, whether or not it's something that gets published or not. Well, we're going to wrap up. Before we do, we're going to do a quick little storytelling.
Sure.
I've got 3 books in front of me, and I'm going to have you choose one of the books, and then we're going to choose a random sentence from a random page. And I'm going to read that sentence, and then that's the first sentence of a 2-minute oral short story. We'll just kind of go back and forth with sentences and see how it goes. So I've got
I'm writing in the third person right now, so this needs to be in third person.
Okay, well, it can go wherever you want. We have Baldacci's Simple Genius.
Yep.
William Kent Kruger's Fox Creek, which I think just came out. and a legal thriller. Grisham's The Street Lawyer. So pick one of those, and then tell me a page.
All right, let's do Street Lawyer at page 125.
Okay. And so I'm going to do something different. So what I've normally done is I've had the person say, give me a number, and that's the sentence number that I choose. It's not always great because it's always, so I'm going to actually just look at this page and I'm going to pick out a sentence myself. This is dialogue heavy. In fact, I think it's entirely, okay, here we go. As a seasoned big city lawyer, I knew there was a purpose behind every lunch and dinner invitation.
Over to me?
Yeah, and over to you. Unless you want me to go first.
Yeah, why don't you go first and get us kick started, then I'll take it from there.
But I questioned why she wanted to meet so late for dinner. I was usually in bed by 9 p.m., but she insisted a dinner starting at 10.
I had been warned before about advances from her, particularly at work. Dinner raised the stakes to another level.
I showed up 5 minutes early and took a seat at the bar, keeping my eye on the front door. I looked down at my watch, hoped, almost prayed that she wouldn't show up. It's probably the only time in my life I was hoping a woman wouldn't show up on time.
But she did.
She walked in and sat down next to me, put her purse on the bar top, breezily ordered a double Grey Goose gimlet, and turned and looked at me and said,
"You're going to finish that beer, and then you're going to grab the revolver in my purse and take care of the person sitting at the booth."
I'd never known her to have a sense of humor. And when I looked at her, I couldn't see any trace of laughter in her eyes. And then I turned and looked at the booth, and indeed there was somebody there. An interesting guy, bald, white suit, probably 100 pounds heavier than me, and he was sweating.
I knew his name, although I'd never seen his face. And to this point, I had never even thought about killing somebody before.
"What's in it for me?" I asked her. She brushed a strand of hair back behind her ear just as the drink was being set down. She took a long, slow sip of it and said, "Whatever you want." We'll call it there. See, that was fun.
That is fun. That's fun. And when I saw, I don't know if you saw this, but you told me earlier that that you shy away from conflict. Yeah. And I kind of lean into it, and you're like, never known her to have a sense of humor before. Like, no, we're going to stay on the conflict piece.
The funny thing is, there's so much conflict and not necessarily always violence, but there's so much conflict in my stories. And so I to your point about it being therapeutic, I think when you write something, you are in a way processing or almost living vicariously through things that are too hard to face in reality. Because at the root of all writing, for me at least, is like, what would I do in this situation? And there's kind of a joy in those situations being dark and knowing that you're safe, but also kind of getting there mentally, even though it wouldn't ever be a place you'd want to be in the real world.
That's right. No doubt.
So, well, listen, Chad, it was great talking to you, and congratulations on your release, which comes out in just a few weeks, right?
That's right. January 31st.
That's awesome. I hope the launch is everything that you'd hoped it would be. It sounds like the lead up to it has already been fantastic, and I'm sure you're going to have great success with it.
Great, Carter. It's been great to meet you and talking to you, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Hope we get to keep in touch. Take care, Chad.
Of course. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. So that's it. That's my conversation with Chad Boudreaux. I told you he was going to be interesting, and he was. I really enjoyed talking to him, and I thought her story was pretty cool. I could see seeing that being turned into something real. I mean, gets into murder pretty quickly, but most of the stories do. If you want to know more about Chad, and I highly encourage you to check more of his information out, and certainly look for his book, Scavenger Hunt. You can just go to his website, chadboudreaux.com. That's BOUDREAUX.com. And if you want to find out more about me or buy my books or sign up for my newsletter or check my appearance schedule, just go to carterwilson.com. So that's it. That is the end of this episode I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. There will be more episodes coming out soon. In the meantime, thanks as always for watching and or listening. Take care.